So let's talk about a feature called custom settings. The idea behind custom settings is that every org has this 10 megabyte in-memory database, okay? This 10 megabytes of in-memory storage is accessible via Visualforce, Apex, formula fields. All these different things can access this. It's a cache, essentially, okay? And we call this cache custom settings, all right? One of the key advantages of custom settings is that when you fetch data, you will not be using up governor resources. So you would programmatically say, and I'll show you how you would do it, fetch me the results for this row, or we have this things called hierarchies, get me this record, and you're not having to do a database query to do that. There are two types of custom settings. To me, the simplest one to understand is the list. And the list is simply a table, okay? And what you can do, and I'll show you the GUI, you would go in and define a new custom setting and think of it just like an S-object. You would create fields on that custom setting, and then what you would do is you'd populate it with data, and then you'd say, fetch for me the value of this field for this particular record that you would identify by its name. Okay? So it's think of it as a table that you can do lookups on to fetch data. The more complex one is the hierarchy. In the list, we're going off of the name. In a hierarchy, we're fetching a record based on its existence associated with the current user's profile, or an org default. Okay? So I'm going to come back to that because it's kind of complex. But here is an example of the list. Here we have bronze, silver, and gold. So maybe we have something like a rewards program, and there's a greeting associated with each of these different levels. And so what you'd do is you'd say, oh, okay, fetch for me the silver level message, and now let's display that message. Hierarchies, on the other hand, are associated not with a value in the name field, but associated with this hierarchy. And the way it works is it says, okay, I'm going to go look for a record associated with the user. If I find one, that's what I'm going to return. If a record is not associated with this user ID, then I'm going to go look for a record associated with the currently logged in user's profile ID. Okay? If that exists, I'm going to fetch that value. If it doesn't, then I'm going to go up to the org default, and I'm going to fetch whatever the value it is, which is the org, whatever specified as the org default. In a profile, we have the system permissions and we used to call them user permissions. I think now we call them app permissions, right? So we have all those checkboxes, all those permissions. Can you create a custom permission? You can't create a custom profile permission, okay? So let's say you want to do that. You want to create a custom profile permission. And so what you do is, mine is called, can you do this thing? Doesn't matter what it is, but it's a Boolean. Can you do this thing within our environment? What we could do is we could create a custom setting, okay? And that custom setting would have this field, which is a Boolean. Can you do this thing? All right? Now, it would map directly. You could create a bunch of these records, if you will, on a profile-by-profile basis. And based on the user's profile, you could check to see, can they do this thing? It would then return true or false, depending upon what is the setting for their profile. And if it doesn't have a record, it would just do the org-wide default, which would probably be no, you can't do this thing. But you could programmatically check for this user's profile, can they do this thing? Okay? Now, what do we have in profiles that override profiles. What feature do we have that overrides profiles? Permission sets, okay? So let's say I have a profile where the "can you do this thing" is set to no. But I have a specific user and I want to, even though their profile is "no, you cannot do this thing," I want to override that for that particular user. In that case, you would create a user level record, and "can you do this thing" would be set equal to yes. Okay? So think of custom settings that way, where we're taking into context, when we're fetching these records to get either data or these flags, you know, can you do this thing based on the profile? And then also we can override that on a user by user basis. All right, so to create a list, it's basically under Develop Custom Settings, create a new one. It looks a lot like an S-object. Okay, so it looks a lot like an S-object. You create the custom setting and then you define the fields. Okay, it's always going to have a name field so that we can do a lookup. Once you define the fields, we offer up a GUI where you can manage the data. So you can go in there and through this default GUI create bronze, gold, and silver level records. In order to programmatically access, so if you're in a list custom setting, if you want to get the gold level record, you're doing a lookup based on the value of the name field essentially. The name of our custom setting is UCAir. We'd call .getInstance and then we'd fetch the specific record that we want. Now that we've fetched that record, we'd access all the different fields. So .greeting, whatever our fields are that we want. You could also do this getAll, which returns a map, load into memory a map of all of your records that are custom settings. A hierarchy, you're going to define the fields much like so that when you're defining the custom setting, it's the exact same in the sense that you go out there and you give it a name and then you define the fields. But when you populate it with data, there's essentially one record for the default org level value. When you create the other ones, you need to specify in the GUI, are you creating a profile level or a user level, and which profile and which user. Okay. When you are fetching your hierarchy settings, there's a number of different options, but the idea is this. When you call getInstance, you're going to either specify a user ID or a profile ID. If you specify a profile ID, what you're saying is, in the hierarchy, start at this level, and then either if you find a record, return it, or return the org default. If you specify a user ID, or for that matter, just leave it blank, it starts at the user level, looks for a record. If it finds it, it returns it. Then it goes up to the profile. If it finds it, it uses it. Otherwise, it goes up to the org default. Okay, so it goes up the tree. All right. And there's a few, you can directly access the org default. There's a slight variation on this, where if no value is specified when you call get values, null is returned. If you want to check to see does it exist, so rather than just getting back the setting. Okay. So here's some sample code. What we're doing is we're saying, all right, let's get back one of our records. We're specifying a user ID. Not sure if it's going to be the one for the user, the profile, or the org. We're just getting back a value, the lowest level value. Okay, and then we can access our greeting much like it was a field. Hierarchies can be used in formula fields, validation rules, and workflow rules. You'll see them as a global variable called $setup. And then in Apex, you can use both list and hierarchy. The reason you can only use these is that you got to essentially specify what you're looking up, and we can only really do that in Apex. We can't really do that in a formula field. So, all right. You can fetch also using Sockle. So ultimately, even though these are in memory, these are in a cache in memory, we still have to persist them somewhere, right? So they're also being persisted, and you can fetch them in the same way that you would using SOQL. Understand now, you've now used up a SOQL query with respect to governors, okay? So if I want to create or modify programmatically a custom setting, just use DML. So if you want to create a new one, instantiate it, insert it, once again, understand you've just used up a DML operation inside of your code. So custom settings programmatically are both read and write, but when you write them, you're using up your DML operations. Okay? So, all right. What are the different parts of Dynamic Apex? What are the things that we throw under the umbrella of Dynamic Apex? Dynamic SOSL, Dynamic SOQL, Schema Describe, and then Dynamic what? Dynamic DML. Very good. What method should be used to get the global list of schema object tokens? Does anyone remember that? Very good. Get global describe. How can we get the list of all fields from an S-object token? Once again, a nice memory question here. The way that we would do this, I don't think anyone would memorize this. If you have an S-object token, you would call getDescribe on that. Once you have the describe result, you would then do .fields, and then you can obtain the map of all of your field tokens. Okay? What are the three methods of the batchable interface that we would need to implement? Start, execute, and not stop, but finish. Very good. All right. What does the scope parameter of the execute batch method signify?
Number of things in the start list that you're handling.
Not in the start list. You're close. No, not no. It's the number of records when the system calls execute, the number of records that we're going to pass to that individual, execution of execute. So it determines the size of each transaction. Okay. By default, is batch Apex stateful or stateless? Stateless. We need to implement the stateful interface. And what are the two types of custom settings? List and hierarchy. Very good.